started if we may.
Richard is in the
On
parking
his way.
garage.
Okay, so they're,
They're close.
So starting there, they will be here. You want this one?
welcome Jennifer. I apologize, we'll be munching.
Oh, I expected it, no
I'm
problem.
gonna cook it.
I think we can go ahead, and here comes Sandra, and
six.
Richard shall be.
He's right behind me.
You guys are good, okay.
Metal, we can build a snowman.
Where was lunch?
It's in the kitchen.
Pardon me.
Little kitchen.
Lunch is in the kitchen for Sandra. Lunch is in the kitchen for now.
Your ability to be sunny is
Incomparable.
I'm glad you're feeling
Inconceivable.
better.
Yes, thank you.
Why do you keep using that word?
That too.
I don't think it means what you think it means.
It didn't work, yeah. So that, wrong letters, wrong numbers. Change this again.
Well, we might as well.
Let's do
I
it.
would say let's go ahead and get started. Richard's going, yes, let's get started.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to introduce the group of experts that are going to talk to you this morning. So I guess it's afternoon. Thanks for taking time to meet with our team to discuss how best to lead Lincoln towards a more successful, secure, and shared future, and how our budget will bring that vision to life. This afternoon, we hope to provide a foundation for a productive dialogue between our administration and the City Council about how the next city budget, will support our shared priorities and direction for the community. So for some of you, this may be your first time through the budget process. For others, it may have been several times. For some on our team, it might be the 30th time that they've been through it. So I just want to acknowledge that we all have different levels of expertise and experience related to the budget, and the way that we want to structure this early dialogue is to make sure that it acknowledges that and then also places value on our shared time together. So you received a budget letter from the mayor on Friday, and you should have copies of the budget calendar as well. And so today we're going to do a brief Budget 101, talk briefly about the CIP and its role in the budget, and then talk about the forecast. So Finance Director Brandon Kaufman's going to talk about our financial projections, which is basically a starting point for us to identify what the trends are that we're seeing in terms of revenues and expenditures, and then how city growth impacts how those revenues and the demand for services will affect how we put the budget together. And we hope that this discussion allows us all to get a good sense of overall city operations and the financial context within which we develop our priorities. And I also just want to say that this is the first of 6 meetings between now and the beginning of March. And so we hope this is where you will share your questions, comments, concerns, and priorities. Although there will be presentations at each of these meetings, we want to know what your priorities are as we start to put together the budget. And you're always welcome to connect with us directly outside of these forums if you have questions or you want to communicate with us about those. So with that, in order to accommodate a meeting at the state capitol, Planning Director David Carey is going to talk briefly about the CIP process, and then Sherry Wolf, our budget officer, is going to come up and just do a brief overview of the Budget 101. So I'll hand it over to David.
Great, thank you.
Before, David, how would you prefer, do you want us to hold our questions till after your presentation or just interrupt? You tell me how you would like.
Oh, I
us-
think ask them whenever they occur. Yeah, we
Okay.
don't need to hold them until then.
Okay. All right, sounds good.
Okay, great,
Welcome.
thank you for a few minutes. My role here today is to give you some kind of background and context for this capital improvement program, part of the budget process. So the capital improvement program is the capital strategy for the city. It is meant for projects and items that will have a lifespan of 15 or more years. And so obviously that's meant to be the longer term investment outside of the operating budget. So we have the operating budget, which is a lot of the focus that we have on departments, but then there's the capital program for our departments as well. The planning department is responsible for the administration of the process to get to a capital program for each budget cycle. And part of that is to have it go to the Planning Commission for a finding of conformity with the comprehensive plan. So that is a specific requirement that we have to take in order for a project to be in the capital budget. It has to have a finding of conformity with the comprehensive plan. So with that, just to give you some context on what the capital budget is and what it is not, what you as the city council actually take action on is the first 2 years of the CIP. That is the capital budget, to go along with obviously the 2-year operating budget for the city. The other 4 years, we have a 6-year capital improvement program. The other 4 years is instructive. It gives you an idea of what the phasing is of some projects perhaps, or what the next priority projects are for the departments. But it's not part of the budget. So it's the capital program that is part of it. The first 2 years of the capital program is what is part of the budget. And that is what has to be taken into account for finances and revenue streams and things like that. I'll also let you know that the timing of the CIP is slightly different than the overall budget proposal, because we do have to get it to the Planning Commission in advance of having it be packaged up with the budget itself. We plan on having the CIP to the Planning Commission in April of this year, and that's so that the budget office has a chance to take that, whatever that final product is, and to bring it into the overall budget process that will eventually get back to you as well. So when you get the operating budget, you'll then have the CIP, which actually will have been public for a little while before that. So you'll have, if you have interest in it at that point, you certainly can take a look at it, give us a call, send us an email if you have some questions. But again, it won't be formal and official until it comes forward as part of the overall budget from the mayor's office, and then you will have that to take action on. So, with that, I can answer any questions you might have at this time. It was definitely meant to just give you some context of the CIP.
James?
I just have a really basic name question, so I just want to make sure I understand this correctly. So for the CIP, essentially the first 2 years is for the budget, but then the 4 years after that is really like a guide of what would be after
Correct.
that. So it's like a 6-year total thing, 2 years is the actual budget, 4 years is, the 4 years after that is just kind of the guide or the vision or whatever.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I have a question. Director Carey, when you say that the CIP has to be in conformity with the comp plan, these first 2 years that we're going to see, or we're going to see the whole 6, but the first 2 years we're going to see post-April will be in conformity with the last comp plan, not with the one that begins tomorrow, or whenever it begins.
Correct.
Okay.
But so let me clarify a little bit. It requires a finding of conformity. It does not necessarily mean it is in conformance with the plan.
Okay.
It can be out of conformance with the plan. It just very rarely happens that way. In my time here since 2003, we've never had a project that found to be out of conformance with the comprehensive plan. We really do work with our departments and make sure that we're following the plan. But as far as the new plan, we won't have a new plan until the end of 2021-ish. So we're going to be using the current 2040 plan definitely through this budget process.
Thank you.
Richard?
Yeah, I was just wondering, kind of the same line, that it's, CIP for 2 years out will only conform with the existing plan.
Yeah, so the next budget cycle, likely, we're going to have a new plan that we'll have to be using that one to do that, to make that.
When does the council see the draft of the CIP? Then?
April? You said April?
Prior to in,
It'll be public, what goes to the planning commission will be public at least a week before the hearing for the planning commission, which I believe is the first week
that's the
of
first
April.
time that the city council will see the CIP?
Normally, that is the first time, yes.
Okay. So if we want changes to the CIP, I guess we wait till it comes to the city council, or do we talk about it prior to it going to planning? Because if we change it at city council, does it have to go back to planning then to be approved, those changes?
So what would have to happen is your process of approval can definitely change the CIP. There's nothing keeping you from doing that. If you came up with a project that has not gone to the planning commission for that finding of conformity with the comprehensive plan, that would have to happen before it could be put in an adjusted CIP. That process would have to happen. Rarely does that, really doesn't happen because we have so many different projects that are already being considered, that moving it from an out year to more the priority for the first 2 years of the budget or vice versa, that wouldn't require it to go back to Planning Commission because it already had been given the project. If it's a brand new project that nobody has thought of yet, that's where we'd have to go back to Planning Commission.
Okay. And there's other things in the CIP other than just road projects and projects like that, right?
Sure. Oh,
I
absolutely.
mean, there's fire engines, there's other equipment, those,
Pretty much all departments are.
all the
represented.
departments will have, all and so if we want changes to those, we can do those anytime. They don't have to go to the planning department?
Well, those two, they do go,
They
all
would
of
have
that,
to
all of
go
that
through
goes
the
through our
planning
process.
department?
Yeah.
Okay.
You gotta distinguish though between when something goes in the CIP, is talking about a 15-year lifespan. So, you know, yeah, fire equipment might be in there, but you're not talking about mowers and,
Right.
you know, smaller type.
Right.
Computers,
Yeah.
that's not.
Right. Okay.
Okay, any other questions? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Now we're going to talk about the operating part of the budget. I'm going to see if I can get over here and drive. Welcome, Sherry.
Hi, Sherry.
How are you?
Well, how are you?
Good. Good to see you.
Can everybody see the screens okay? Okay.
Mine is not going.
Thank you, Benny.
Okay, Jennifer's gonna.
Usually John Kemp comes by a little
And
late.
just walk.
I'll wax his head
Puts
on
his
it.
shoulder on
Oh,
it.
he does.
He did that every stinking time he walked in.
I know.
Yes.
Ouch.
We should have checked his peripheral vision, maybe. All right, you guys can all see? All right, we're going to start out just briefly talking about the budget process. The budget process is governed largely by the city charter, the municipal code, and some state laws. So a lot of the schedule and those type of things that we've laid out, we don't have a lot of flexibility in it without changing some legislation. The city charter requires that we have a balanced budget for one thing. It limits appropriation of property taxes to 90% of the amount that we actually expect to collect in a given fiscal year. It defines largely the schedule that we build the budget on. And it also defines some of the content of the budget. It requires a message from the mayor that regarding her financial plans for the upcoming budget, schedules of revenues by source and expenditures by program or activity for each year, and the debt schedules and the capital improvement schedules. Those things are all laid out in the charter or the city code. State law, of course, we have the restricted funds lid that covers our property tax revenues, our sales tax revenues, highway allocation funds, and Brandon's going to discuss the lid in a little bit more detail when he does the forecast. But essentially, it limits those sources of revenue to increases of 2.5% each year. We also have in state law a levy limit. It's 45 cents for municipalities, and you can get an additional 5 cents for interlocal agreements. We don't pay a lot of attention to that one with our tax rate currently at just over 31 cents, almost 32 cents, I guess. We're far enough under that levy lid that it doesn't have much impact on us. State law also lays out the schedule and the notification requirements for setting the tax rate. It's necessary for us to pass a separate tax rate after a separate resolution after the tax rate is adopted by state law. And state law also provides flexibility for us to make some amendments to the budget. We talk about unforeseen circumstances are typically required. Something that you couldn't reasonably have anticipated at the time you set the budget is necessary in order to make those amendments. And the state law also sets out some notification and public hearing requirements for that process.
So I want to point out the budget calendar for those that have been involved in the budget process, you know, August is our month for dealing with the changes and amendments and proposals. So usually it's a month where we're really enjoying summer in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Yes, usually right here in this room or the council chambers, right? Thank you, Jane. That was one of my big points on that calendar, my next slide here. Exactly. And so Jennifer mentioned too that this has been distributed. Again, these dates come largely from the city charter or the code or some resolutions that were passed several years ago by the council to lay out a budget process. So again, yes, please plan to spend your summer with us. And also, I think Jennifer already mentioned that the outcome meetings that'll be coming up here in January through early March are a really good opportunity for council members to share your priorities or your thoughts about budget priorities, I guess, early in the process.
And Roy, did you want to say something about the tax rate? You usually do.
I usually do, but I'll hold off.
What do you usually? I don't mean to put you on.
I like to keep the tax rate low.
Besides low,
That's
you always
shocking to me.
you usually remind people that
That's
the
not a
tax-
newsflash.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's not news. I think we're all on that same page, but the important thing, takeaway, is that the tax rate does have to be in sync with the budget that we approve.
Right, that has to be the same.
It has to be the same.
Something you might think about, like this June 15th to the 26th is gonna be a really intense period because you're gonna be meeting with departments, going over all their budgets. And then from there, you've got kind of this time where you can think about proposals and submit them to the budget office. And then, you know, by July 20th, you're voting on those tentative changes. So that gives us an early indication of where, you know, potentially you would like to change the budget. The last thing we want to get to is, you know, August 26th, and there's changes coming in. We're trying to crunch numbers on the fly, and that's the absolute last date that we can make any changes in the budget. So the earlier the better, especially in that July timeframe, is going to be very helpful to us.
Change early, change often.
Any questions?
I do have a question, pardon me. It has to do with changes to the budget at the end of the process. So I certainly understand why you don't want to crunch numbers in the last week, in the last couple of days. But when we're having conversations with you in mid-June, and we vote, and we let you know what changes we'd like in July, mid-July, we don't have a public hearing until the 1st of August. Is there really a good amount of time for us to incorporate any suggestions we may get from the public in the budget? Or is, I realize we have public in the room right now and I'm asking you a question that's, sorry, pardon me, it's right off the top of my head. How much leeway is there for us to incorporate public comment after the 3rd of August?
After the 3rd of August, I mean, you've still got, you know, this August 7th date where you can get those final changes in. So, I mean, hopefully we're to the point there where that's the kind of the last changes that potentially could come in. I know the mayor's office is probably talking about how they're going to handle communications and stuff with the budget as well, and how they might incorporate feedback.
I mean, I think our hope is that we will have, through this dialogue early here, understand not only your priorities, but your ideas related to revenue and expenditures and those kinds of issues. So early on, that's an opportunity for us to understand what's important to each of you and to you as a body. At the same time, you know, you're going through all of the budget in that June timeframe. And so the public hearing, it doesn't mean it can't happen. I don't know if in your experience, have you seen a lot of unique issues never raised prior to the public hearing?
No.
Never raised. That's
Yeah,
the key
we
word.
won't. Keep in mind, that we're having these discussions. You know, we get the budget,
Started 2 weeks ago.
yeah, the 15th of June. Now, that's an intense 6 weeks, no doubt. But usually the issues that the council members have are brought up within the first week of having the budget. And just to consider that's the only thing you'll probably read during that first week. But, you know, it's like there's no surprises by the time you reach August 7th and August 12th. People know what the issues that they are important to them are and have been negotiating and talking, and so.
And I want to be clear that those conversations not only are, and priorities are coming from the council, but I assume you and our office as well will be out in public talking about what we have included in the budget, how we have tried to address challenges and priorities as we put the budget together. So we anticipate a robust public dialogue that happens not just at the public hearing, but prior to it.
And plus, Jennifer, don't we have the survey results coming out? I mean, the survey's going out.
Yes, so we
We'll get
issued
those
the
back,
survey
right?
between last week and this week. We will see those returned by mid-February, and then we anticipate having that kind of public feedback on citizen satisfaction by the end of March. So we anticipate trying to use that information to help put our budget together as well.
And we can always fall back on the old one as well. That was a good indication of people's priorities in our community. But it's great to have, you know, a look into the new one.
Yeah.
See if things have changed, so.
Yeah, and we'll be sharing that with you as well.
But it will be an intense 6 weeks.
It'll
I
be
don't doubt
fun.
that.
It's fun.
Fun.
It's the same usual suspects.
Focused, concentrated fun.
I'm just absorbing this. You guys said it's going to be fun.
Fun,
I'm going to hold you to that.
Fun, damn it.
Any more questions about the schedule or the process before we kind of move on to Budget 101 and talk a little bit about how the budget is structured?
Push the button.
Here are the big books that you're being encouraged to study up a little bit, particularly if this is your first time through the process. I realize they're two really large documents. They're largely very detailed reference documents, but for the operating budget in particular, I would kind of steer you towards the first 3 tabs at the beginning of the book. There's a introduction and a tab about some of our policies, and also the financial plan that includes some good summary information that will help you understand the structure of the budget if you're going through it for the first time.
I'm also going to let people know that in my office, open, I leave the door unlocked, there are 20 years of budget books on the shelf.
We would be happy to share all those documents with you as well. And a number of them are, I can't say off the top of my head how many years, enough to get the history, are also on our budget website as well. Yes. Okay, we actually do, those documents anyway, actually contain many budgets for a lot of individual funds. Funds may have a designated source of revenue that can only be spent on specific activities, is typically what divides our fund groups. The general fund is where the majority of our public safety and other very vital city services are budgeted. We don't designate, although these departments have their own fees and cost recovery charges in some cases, they don't generate anywhere near enough money to fund their operations. So they're funded largely with property and sales tax, and we don't distinguish in those funds who gets how many property tax dollars and who gets how many sales tax dollars. That's all just accounted for within the general fund. Special revenue funds have considerable revenue, but they still require a general fund subsidy. They don't have enough funding sources to cover their operations. The capital project funds account for projects that might have multiple funding sources. This is a way to bring the total cost of a project together when it has various funding sources. Of course, our debt service funds are where we account for bond proceeds and principal and interest payments. Permanent funds are typically from trust or endowments, and we can only spend the earnings. Parks and aging and library have some trust endowment type funds, and police and fire pension is probably one of our biggest funds that falls in that category.
ask at some point, might as well be now, you mentioned police and fire pension fund. When do we anticipate seeing that report this spring?
It should be shortly. I know HR's gonna have that. Jennifer?
We talked about incorporating that into one of the 5 meetings that we're going to
Okay.
have, because they will have the results of the valuation, and then there was recently an experience study done, so we thought maybe doing an update on the pension fund as part of our, here is something that you need to think about as we put the budget together, would be a good opportunity.
Will the fund managers come like they have in the
Yes,
past?
if that's how they've done in the past,
Yeah,
yes.
they've
it'd
done
be
in
the
the
same.
past, yeah. Okay.
All right. Jumping back into our fund types, enterprise funds are self-supporting. This would be largely like our utility funds, water and wastewater fund. And our internal service funds, their revenue sources are other city funds. They're for services like fleet services, information services, radio shop, some of those things are internal service funds.
IT, that one?
And if you're not,
Information
if
services.
this is like your first really experience delving into like governmental accounting, just think of it like, we have a bunch of checking accounts. And, you know, we have a checking account for the water, we have a checking account for the wastewater, and we have to segregate all these funds for various purposes, so that's why we just have a bunch of checking account ledgers that we keep throughout the city.
Can you explain the special revenue funds again to me real quick?
So those are things that are limited by purpose, so it's either limitations set by the city council, there's limitations set by state statute, so, you know, we get money for motor fuel tax, and that can only be spent for street purposes. So that's set aside into a special revenue account and set up for that specific purpose, or we have 911 communications as a special revenue. You know, it's supported by some fee revenue from the state that we get for 911 taxes, but not enough, so then we transfer money from the general fund over to 911. So it's just a number of accounts like that, like Star Training Operating, the health fund. They generally have some fees, or they're limited in what the revenue can be used for.
So sorry.
Go ahead.
Here's a question that I have, just because I don't know. This is gonna sound really weird. So it's kind of like blood types, right? Like, so like general funds can go into any one of those accounts, but like enterprise fund can't go into like stuff that goes in for special revenue funds, right?
See, like, this is your discretionary funding.
Okay.
214 million is discretionary. The rest of these have specific purposes and uses that are set aside. See, you know, water is set aside for the water utility. You can't just take money and transfer that over to the general fund, typically without some type of purpose behind that or support, so.
So once once funding from the discretionary funds gets moved into something else, it can't be transferred over to anything else, right?
It's gonna set aside for that purpose. So,
Okay.
you know, once we transfer this taxing money over to, let's say, that special revenue, like we're transferring some money over to 911, it's kind of in that 911 bucket.
After the meeting starts.
It's set up for that
It
purpose.
can't be, okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha, thanks.
Does that help?
Yeah, that does, thanks.
And yes, I apologize, I see you guys looking at the tiny little box down here in the corner is the permanent or the trust funds that you can't read.
I failed the eye test.
We knew that was a little difficult.
That graph's set up in proportion to
Yeah,
the overall.
I like the
That's why they're
graphic of
tiny.
it. I like the graphic of it, but.
Oops, we lost, are they coming in? We lost them. All right, I'm gonna have to cheat for you guys and tell you what this represents. So essentially, we have, oh, they're coming. Where's general fund? We have 6 tax funds. So, this is the general fund. It's 177 million. This box is supposed to represent the library fund for 10 million. Social Security is 3 million. Police and fire pension here is 18.8 million. And what we got here? And the debt service fund is 5.5 million.
No, unemployment fund doesn't show up because it's so small. It's only
Exactly.
50,000.
We had all this on paper not that long ago. I don't know where it went.
And you all have a slide packet in your email. So, and it showed up on the printed version, but not.
again, so the purpose of this slide was just to identify for you what the 6 tax funds are, and again, to show that the large majority of that is the general fund. All right, and then we're gonna talk about the sources of funding for the tax funds. Sales tax is 37 million, property tax is 31 million.
37%.
I'm sorry, that's what I'm looking at, I'm like, what are these numbers? I'm sorry, percents. Property tax is 31%, and all the other sources are 27%. So again, one of the points to be taken here is that although departments have their fees, that we sometimes spend a lot of time thinking about other charges to reimburse costs of programs. It's a pretty small percent of our total revenues. Sales tax, we don't have a lot of control over what's coming in. We can't really change the rate on that, so a lot of our focus then goes to property tax because that's one of the variables that we do have some control over.
What about occupation tax of that 4.21%? Has it stayed constant, or is that a decreased percentage?
I'm gonna go into that here
Okay.
in a bit, and I'll cover some of these
Okay.
kind of sales and property and occupation tax in a
Okay.
little more detail.
All right, and this is one of our favorite slides because we like to show that the city is a small percentage of the total property tax dollar. Obviously, we need to do our part to keep
Say that again
low.
louder, yeah.
Speak into the microphone. So the city's share of the total property tax is about 16%.
And the frustrating part over the years that I've witnessed is we get 16% of the property tax, and we'll have 30 to 40 people show up for our budget hearing, and the schools get 61%, and they'll have 2 people show.
Yep.
16% of the revenue, 100% of the blame.
Yes.
Not quite 100, but pretty
Needs
close.
some help.
It makes sense.
Yes.
I think so.
And
Just make it as confusing as.
Yeah.
this slide illustrates that the vast majority of our tax-funded expenditures are taken up by personnel costs. Those personnel costs are largely governed by comparability rules, again, state law that sort of determines largely how our labor negotiations come out. So that's a number that, it's a huge percentage, and we don't have a lot of control over how it grows. This other large category, transfers and services and charges, the transfers in there would include the subsidies that go to those special revenue funds like StarTran and health and aging. So that makes up a big chunk of that category.
Like subsidy sharing, is that what you're talking about? Sometimes are those transfers?
That is how they get to the health fund or the StarTran fund. So
Okay.
here in our total expenditures, they do show up as transfers. So with that, we have one more slide here. So this shows by department where the tax-funded dollars go. And so the top half of the slide reflects that, safety and security is our highest priority to the community, and that takes up over 53% of our tax funds budget. So when you look at the remaining tax-funded departments, those are the places we typically focus in trying to make adjustments to the budget, and it's less than half of the budget that we have to work with.
What would be,
You go.
what would be under miscellaneous budgets?
Miscellaneous budgets, probably the largest chunk of that is the fringe benefits for all of these departments are budgeted centrally. So the health insurance, the life insurance, those kind of benefits. Otherwise, we try, contingency is in there, is one thing. The general,
Cash in retirement stuff?
I'm sorry?
When people retire?
the tax-funded pension is in there. Yes, one of the fringe benefits. Mhm. Benny, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm struck by the numbers. I usually try to help educate the public on this, and I usually say about 70 cents of your tax dollar goes to personnel cost. And is that still fair to say? I'm looking at the 53% for safety, and I'm thinking, is my number too low?
No, because that 53% includes the fringe benefits for the public safety departments. If we go back
Go back
to
to
the
the other-
personnel slide, or to the, there we go, personnel costs are 66%, so you're pretty close.
I was a little high. Yeah. Thank you.
With that, if there's no more questions, I think we're ready for Brandon to jump into the
Those-
forecast.
Those numbers in there, is that just the general fund? Or is that
Tax.
all?
Tax funds, so again, those
Tax
6 funds that we talked about, that then would include police and fire pension, anything that gets a subsidy, some of
Parking
those.
revenue, parking fund,
Parking is an enterprise
Enterprise.
fund.
Enterprise funds.
and that's in here?
No,
No,
it's not.
The
That's what I
water,
was asking.
sewer's not in there,
Right.
parking's not in
Those are
there.
different checking
These are
accounts.
general fund
Utility.
numbers,
The golf fund is not in there.
or is there also enterprise funds in here?
These are governmental funds, so we're talking about general, so these are just the tax funds. So they're primarily funded through property tax revenues.
So that's not just their budget. That's not urban development's main budget. That's just their funds.
That's just their general fund portion, but it doesn't include their grants and aid for CDBG, doesn't include parking. So there's a number of other funds. You know, we get a lot of, or we talk a lot about taxing funds typically because, you know, that's where the majority of all property tax goes into. And that's your largest discretionary pool of funding. So that's where a lot of the time is spent. You know, when you start talking about enterprise funds,
You have this one.
when you start talking about enterprise funds and you're looking at, you know, the CIP and, you know, that's where their rates are shaped by the operating budget and capital. So, you know, water, wastewater, they're gonna have maybe 50% of their budget's gonna be paying for capital expenses and 50 is gonna be paying for operating. So it's gonna vary by fund, but these taxing funds are basically your largest discretionary source of use, so.
Okay, so this slide showing all these budgets is not really all their expenditures. It's not the whole budget.
No, and if you kind of, this 584 million total,
Is the
you
budget.
see,
Okay.
today we're gonna be primarily taking up time on this 214 million,
Okay.
which is the taxing fund. As we go through the budget process, you know, you'll spend more time on enterprise funds, water, wastewater, special revenue, which is, you know, street construction, the wheel tax goes into a special revenue. So, you know, you're gonna get more time, I think, with these other funds, but today is primarily concentrating on the taxing.
So, but it's fair to say that more than half the taxing funds goes towards safety and security.
Definitely. Okay, let's see, where were we? Okay, assumptions, so just cover some of the basics real quick and before we get started into the forecast. So, like I said, this is very early in the process. So, you know, from January until basically August 26th, you know, and actually until June 15th, there's a lot of changes that are going to occur. So there's a lot of broad assumptions that are built into any type of forecast. We know there's a few changes, like we know there's pension dollars that are going to be required to increase based off of the experience study and the actuarial recommended contribution rates that are going to be coming. So those are things that we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks. But we have, like I said, you know, 66% is personnel. We got 5 contracts that still need to be negotiated. Health insurance rates need to be set. We've got a lot of, you know, work comp, general liability, insurance rates, and we've got some impacts there with climate associated issues and weather impacts with the flooding, where we could see some drastic increases in those. And we got a legislature in session, and, you know, we could have impacts that come through that session as well. So there's still a lot of changes that are going to be made until June 15th. But by June 15th, you're going to receive a balanced budget. That's the mayor's proposed budget. That'll be handed off to the city council at that point to make any recommended changes that you wish.
Brandon, are you going to dive in deeper and talk about sales tax?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so once again, a reminder, we have 6 taxing funds that, sales tax goes all into the general fund, and then property tax is split between these 6. So, primarily between those other 5, they're primarily funded by property tax. Besides police and fire pension, where you might have investment earnings that are going on there, but library, they're gonna have a small amount of fees and fines that are coming in. We get some money from the county as well, but it's gonna be, the majority of it's supported by property tax. Just once again, you saw this graph earlier, but just overall revenues. So first revenue that I really want to talk about is property tax. So property tax is driven by 2 factors primarily. This makes up 31% of the revenues, and it increases through 2 things. You get new construction in the community, and you have revaluations on existing properties. You can see by this graph here, this is broken down into category types for valuation. So residential and commercial make up 95% of that total valuation. So, the majority of all increases are driven by residential and commercial in the community. If you saw the article yesterday that the county assessor came out with, he's basically said residential is going to be fairly flat, and we're going to see some increases in commercial. Now, they didn't indicate any type of percent or anything like that. And how this works is we get the final number really late in the process. So we're talking August 20th is the date that the assessor has to deliver that to cities. So by the time you went through all these proposed changes, we get the final valuation numbers, and then typically there's some adjustments that are made right at the end of the process. Before that, right now the assessor typically comes out in January and says, here's the overall picture where we think we're going to be. And then they go through the informal process through March. And then in March, they have to deliver information to the state. So we get a report that we can look at the numbers a little bit better. And then there's still formalized protest period that they go through until you hit that date on August 20th and we get the final number. So we're very early on. We've included broad overall estimates.
And oftentimes they deliver the number prior to August 20th,
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
And I know they try to be really good about that.
Yeah, and they have been great these past few years, and we're getting it 3-4 days early, which gives us a little bit of prep time so we can get the numbers back to the city council. So right now, this is kind of our forecast moving forward. We're estimating a 2.69% increase for 2021, and then about a 3.35% increase. So the blue is the actual changes that have occurred in the past, and the orange is the estimated changes that we're making right now. So this, I think we approach this, we're probably fairly conservative in how we estimate revenues. We've included about a 6% increase in commercial improvements. But like I showed you in that earlier slide, commercial makes up a smaller amount, so the impact overall is not going to be as great. And then I think in that second year, 21-22, we included about a 5% increase for residential improvements. So that's thinking about some type of valuation change on the residential in the second year. Now, we haven't received any indication of that from the assessor's office. But, these last 2 cycles, you can see we had the 6.2 was residential, and then we had a fairly flat year, followed by another residential, followed by commercial revaluation, followed by a residential revaluation. So I think we're just intending to be very conservative and not estimating major impacts on a revaluation moving forward. We've built in some increases, but not significant.
Your 2.69 basically is growth, almost.
It's some revaluation on commercial side and a little bit, probably mostly new construction on residential.
Right.
But even, I watch building permits on a monthly basis, and I think this past year we've seen those drop down a little bit too, so. I don't think we're gonna see the valuation increases moving forward that we have these past few years. So sales tax by far the most volatile revenue stream that we have. It's hard to project. Our access to data is very limited. We get barely any information from the state on it. And I think that's due to privacy concerns that the state has. So we can send one individual over to check on stuff, but they can't come back and talk about it. So we, yeah.
Go over and find out, but don't say.
Yeah, I mean, it's very restricting on what anybody can discuss. So we can have one person access sales tax information, but they can't come back and tell us, hey, Amazon is paying this.
Well, can't they tell exactly, this bucket has sales tax generated by online sales purchases? Can't they do that?
They can't do that either.
They can't do
They
that?
claim they
Not-
can't.
So even in the aggregate, even if they hide where
Right.
it's coming from,
So so if I'm Walmart and I have 5 stores in Lincoln, they're gonna send one check from Bentonville to the state of Nebraska for the city of Lincoln. And that's gonna cover all their locations, physical locations, and it's gonna cover their online. So they just, when reporting, they just mix everything together. So they can never tell us, hey, this is gonna be the impact of online. And I've got a graph coming up, I'll show you real quick, that shows kind of the impact since we've received online
But
sales tax.
don't other states specifically tell them to report distinctly, clearly, and segregate the funds? This is your line item from sales tax from online sales, this is your, brick and mortar sales tax.
I can't tell you that,
Okay.
I can't answer that, we can look into it, but
Wait, you can't make,
I can't imagine the state actually saying that's what you need to do. I can see the state saying, we need to have your sales taxes.
I wonder if other states do that, though.
I think the state would have to change the way that they require businesses to report income information.
Okay.
So the way we look at sales tax, we look at this a little bit from a historical perspective. So we take a 12-year sample of the last 12 years of sales tax, and we look at it from a confidence level. So that means I'm 95% confident that we're going to end up somewhere between 1.82% increase over the prior year to a 4.46% increase to the prior year. So you can see that's a pretty big range. And like I said, we have tended to be fairly conservative in our estimates, and I'll show you our forecast moving forward, but we're 95% confidence we can go somewhere in between 4.46 and 1.82. This is what we've seen on a monthly basis. So 18-19 is the green. You can see September through May, our performance was about a 0.61% increase over the prior year. Then we started 6.92, 7.58, 7.73, and then moving into the current fiscal year, 6.17, 3.95, and 7.18. So we've seen substantial increases over the prior year. June is the first time that we received, or that's when the implementation of online sales tax. It went into effect in May. There's a two-month lag, and then we received first in June. So I think across the state, we've seen a lot of impact overall, even with other municipalities, for online sales tax. So we're hopeful, I think, with the impact of online sales tax moving forward. But as we go forward on sales tax projections too, so right now we're projecting the current year to be about a 3.95% increase over the prior. I think we budgeted at 2%, and this includes 6% increase through the remainder of the year until we hit that year-over-year increase where that online sales tax went into effect. So for the forecast right now, we're on the lower end of that 95% confidence. We're saying and I told you that was 1.82, so we're forecasting right now a 1.82 increase for 2021, and then a 3.14 increase for 2021-22.
Okay.
Occupation taxes, so this is all of the occupation taxes that go into the general fund. You can see in 12-13, we collected 12.04 million. In 18-19, we collected 8.67 million. So that's about a 28% drop in occupation taxes. We're continuing that forecast to drop moving forward. About 96% of telecommunication or occupation taxes are split between two areas. It's telecommunications and cable franchise. And telecommunications has been dropping substantially over the years. And I can't sit here today and tell you why. I don't think Sprint or Alltel, I don't think the number of cell phones is decreasing. But the number of revenues that we're receiving from occupation taxes is
Do you
decreasing.
think the cord cutting has something to do with it?
The majority of, so let's say Verizon, you know, even their revenues that we're receiving from them
And then we're
are,
going down too.
Yeah.
And they don't have any cable
yeah.
stuff, so.
So I'm not sure what's going on there. I think it's something, you know, we could potentially look at auditing moving forward if that's the case that we need to look at. So I just put a slide in here and give you the overall assumptions. You can see we just forecast a flat tax rate. You know, that's decided between the mayor and the city council. So from a forecast perspective, we don't make any changes there. It's got the property valuation estimates, sales tax estimates, occupation, and then this LES return on equity. That makes about 4% of our total revenues too. So we're estimating about 2% increase there. Expenditures. We've looked at past historical increases. So right now we're estimating about 3.7% increase in personnel, supplies 2%, service charges. It goes up and down in the general fund. That's because every few years we have to fund an election. So we see higher increases in those years than in others. Transfers, these 4%, those are the transfers that are going out to the other funds. So 911, health. So that helps support those operations. Capital outlay equipment, 3%. Capital outlay improvements, flat. Contingency, flat. And then we've got some estimates for police and fire pension. We know that's going to change a little bit because we have some of those numbers now. So this gives you the forecast for the current year, or for the upcoming biennium. You can see we're projecting a deficit about 6 million in 2021 and 8.5 million in 21-22. Like I said, we're being fairly conservative in how we're approaching the forecast. A lot can change and a lot will change from now. And also just want you to know, while 6 million sounds rather large right now, you know, we're talking about 2.8, 2.9% of the total overall budget. So, you know, that 6 million figure does sound large, but in scope of everything, you know, we're talking about 2.9%. So, you know, this is a manageable process. It's been managed in the past and it'll be managed moving forward. So I don't want to cause any alarm, but this is just where we're at right now. We have overall general, you know, those assumptions we just talked about. So those are going to change as we move forward.
I got a question about that.
Okay.
So you said that like this deficit doesn't like freak you out really, right?
No.
Okay, so what percentage would be like an alarming number?
Yeah, I know.
You know, where it would be kind of a crisis, or some what would be a percentage that would freak you out? You know what I mean? Like, are we like close to it? Are we far away from it?
It's like the finance guy, anything.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we don't want to be in a position where we have a projected deficit, but, you know, at least we're not talking about 5 to 10%. I mean, that
would be the number.
that'd be,
I would make me nervous.
yeah.
Right. But on the pension, you looked, it was a 9 point something increase. That's a big increase.
Well, I think
concerning?
you'll hear from, there's a couple things impacting that, and we'll get into this a lot more in depth, I think, in the next few weeks, but there's a few things impacting that. It was this experience study that we just went through and our expected rate of return, and whether or not we need to lower that over the next few years. And then also the rate we just earned on our last, I think was maybe around 2.8 or something.
Right.
So, you know, our benchmark's 7.5 and we hit 2.8 or something like that. So once they go through that study, it's gonna increase the amount required.
Wait, we only hit 2.8 on our
think-
investments?
Don't quote me on that, but we're off the benchmark there, so.
Oh, that's,
Well, the only number I saw that concerned me, I guess, is 3.7% increase in personnel expenses when the inflation rate for the United States is 2.1.
Yeah.
There's a disconnect there, you know.
I understand all these we've got, so a couple things. We've got CRR that requires comparability. So we're always comparing to metros that are similar to Lincoln in size and negotiating from that standpoint. All the contracts come through council for approval. So you're gonna see everything come through there. But, you know, when you're talking, I don't know, what's police get, 2.5 step plus merit on top of that. So, you know, when your expenditures continue to grow above that 3.7 and the revenues aren't growing at the same pace, then, you know, that's where we're gonna, moving forward, have some deficit type issues, so. And I'll talk about restricted funds here pretty quick too, if I can get into that. So this is more what scares me. So restricted funds limits our major revenues to 2.5% growth. So sales tax, property tax, you know, and those are the taxes that make up the majority of our overall taxing funds. So this has a blue line that represents 2.5% growth, and then it has that orange line represents 2.5 plus a 1% council. And you can expand that by 6 out of 7 members voting to receive that extra 1%. In my mind, this is the largest looming fiscal crisis that the city has, because, you know, if we're paying contracts that are out above, if personnel's 66% of our expenditures, and we're approving increases in personnel costs that are above that 2.5%, but then the city's not allowing itself to receive anything above that 2.5, then at some point, once we get that blue line dips below 0, that's when we have to cut our revenues. So to me, that's kind of the biggest looming fiscal crisis that we have, because then you're talking about how do we afford maintaining our current service levels without cutting those any further, making further adjustments to decrease service level. You know, this is a forecast. There are so many things that change, even with this restricted funds. But to me, in my mind, this is the largest fiscal crisis that the city's going to have over the next few years once we exhaust kind of that calculation.
so Bren, do you remember how many years we have failed to vote 6 in favor of that 2.5% plus 1?
There's a number of years, I think, because going back to 98, I don't think votes were taken on the 1%. And then once they were started to be taken, I think there was maybe 1 year where it was approved. It's a fairly routine vote across all municipalities. I'd say, you know, out of the larger cities in Nebraska, I think we're one of the ones that are struggling with this. You know, Omaha, this balance that they have calculated is somewhere up to $60 million. But they regularly approve that extra 1%.
As well as Lancaster County Board of Commissioners, they routinely approve it.
Quick question though, is what caused the big increases every 4 years? In the
And I
growth?
can't tell you, I can't go back and tell you like 13, 14, but in 17, 18, so there's all these things you can exempt out of restricted funds calculation. So in the 17, 18 budget, we did a lot of shifts to take as many exemptions as we could possible with this restricted funds calculation. But exemptions in the long run aren't gonna save the city fiscally. It's growing the base. And the only way you can grow that base is you get the 2.5% automatically. You can get, new construction that's above 2.5%,
You get
which
that
is
automatically.
fairly rare, to go above 2.5 with our size of a tax base. The council can approve it, with 6 out of 7 votes. You can approve it through a special election. And then the funnest one that you can do, if you could pull this off, is a town hall meeting.
Yeah.
And you
So
have
if
to
you
have
get
a lot
like
of people.
Husker football game
The
where
stadium.
only, yeah,
Yeah,
only the city of Lincoln residents are invited.
Wow.
Really?
yeah.
Let's
You
try
can do a
it.
town
How
hall.
many people do you have to have there?
Like
40%
40,000?
of the registered voters.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
there's
okay.
some entities, like a small fire district or something that can do that automatically just by holding their public hearing and the board
Yeah.
voting,
Yeah.
but very small.
I've got
Not
a
gonna build
question
it.
for you.
That's not
If you
us.
could redo this diagram to help me visualize this better and just change everything and make it go up instead of down.
Okay.
Because when you have 2.5% growth and you show it going down, that is counterintuitive. So, but what we got, I think what we'll show if we adjust it so it's going up is the 2.5% growth like this, and the expenditure is going to meet it. And when those lines meet, then you can't, instead of showing it diverging here, or
Yeah.
meeting with the 0 baseline, those two lines, when they converge, that's your crisis point.
Okay.
These are balances, not income, right?
Yeah, these are balances. Yeah. Okay.
That makes sense to
Yeah,
you,
we
right?
can, we can look at that, see how we
Okay.
can. So I think that's where I'm at today. If there's no more questions, I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Yeah, I think just to follow up, I would just reiterate a couple of things that Brandon and Sherry said, which is we will present a balanced budget when we come back to the council on June 15th. And, although we're identifying a project where we're trying to solve for a $6 million number, want to keep in mind that in terms of our tax-funded budget, again, which is, we predict about $217 million, it's less than 3% of the entire tax-funded budget. So, again, it's not a crisis, it's a process and a problem to be solved, but it's not insurmountable, and we'll be able to focus on the programs and policies that we think are important to keep moving the community forward. So we are evaluating potential solutions at this time, and we welcome your suggestions in terms of revenue issues, program efficiencies, innovative ways of doing business. We think having all of those potential solutions on the table is important in terms of having a robust conversation about the budget. But we want to do that without sacrificing the level of service that we're currently providing to the residents of the community. And that's one of our major priorities in terms of getting through this budget process. So I'm happy to answer any questions, or if there are requests for information, even if we can't answer it right here, right now, I'll take that information in and we'll make sure that we get it back to you. So let me know how we can be most helpful.
No, thank you. That's
Yeah.
very,
That's
very
great.
good for
Very helpful.
some of us.
Yeah, I know that we will get more in depth to StarTran. I know that's certainly something that we hear about frequently, funding for StarTran. How much more additional funding would we need to progress out of phase 1 to phase 2, from phase 2 to phase 3? That's, one issue.
Hey.
Hey,
No, they do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are
Yeah,
we done, Chair?
thank you.
we are adjourned.
Thank you very much.
2 p.m.
2 p.m.